what's happening there is the natural fallout of hormones, and that can be navigated with the conventional HRT approaches. And actually, some women who don't want that get on really well with those herbal approaches as well. However, I think that the functional wellness approach really comes into its own with women who are having a challenging menopause. So what I mean by that is someone who has gone to the doctor, and let's say for simplicity's sake, she is over 40. She's obviously perimenopausal, and they've put her on HRT. And the HRT doesn't work, and she feels worse, or her anxiety's gone through the roof. So now she's being prescribed antidepressant, and she's struggling, and she's piling on weight, and the anxiety, but not sleeping, but nothing seems to be working. I think that's where the functional approach really works, because what it looks like in practice is, my experience is that there are often what I call hormonal red flags that go all the way back, usually to puberty and even before. Irritable bowel syndrome, headaches and migraines, maybe some bad skin, heavy bleeds, painful bleeds, just stuff that we just pass off.
Today on Soma Says, I am joined by Claire Snowdon-Darling, who is an author, public speaker, and educator on women's health and menopause. Welcome to the show, Claire. I just wanted to officially introduce you to my podcast, Soma Says. You're known for transforming your own health struggles into a career, which I find fascinating because I feel a lot of us who go into healthcare, it took me a while to understand this and appreciate it and accept it within myself that I was essentially trying to save myself by helping others. Can you share your personal experience that drew you towards this field and ultimately founding the College of Functional Wellness and all of the great advocacy work that you do?
Great question. So if I kind of start with the first part of your question, which is what drew me to this as a career, I think the truth is, back as a teen, I was fascinated by the more complementary aspects of health. So, but back here then, in the 90s, complementary health, there wasn't really an option. You could be a physio, an osteopath, or you went into beauty and you did health and beauty, and that's where the reflexologies and things were. And none of those things really gripped me, but I was fascinated by health in general. Couldn't feel going to be a nurse, didn't have the education, the belief in my academic ability to go and pursue being a doctor. And so ended up going down another career pathway, which I also really loved. I actually worked in theatre and I specialized working with people with learning disabilities. So there was always this care aspect that kind of came through, and the advocacy piece. When I look back, there is a through line between self-expression and advocacy. But what happened was in 2004, I gave birth to my wonderful daughter, who's now 21, and we both nearly died in the labor process. Like, my first recollection is waking up in recovery with this overwhelming tiredness that never went away. And we're talking for 15 years, this horrific tiredness of 15 years. So what I came to realize was something like chronic fatigue syndrome, also postnatal depression. I ended up in postpartum psychosis, being diagnosed with a form of PTSD. Everything just cracked open. I just desperately wanted to feel better. I started to develop an interest in nutrition and in alternative medicine in general. And I discovered at the time kinesiology and nutrition. I went crazy, trained in about 16 modalities, but the two that really gripped me were kinesiology and nutrition. And I was trying to get myself well, but had also discovered a way to help other people get well. So I set up my practice. But then moving into the second part of your question is what then led me into the more functional aspects of wellness and to founding the college. That kind of happened a bit by accident, because I had a great in clinical practice, great career in clinical practice. I wasn't getting myself. I was doing everything that I was told by the complementary therapist I was seeing. I was doing all the things that were at the time sort of, this is the way to do things. I tried everything. There was no stone unturned. And I was also working with a variety of medical practitioners because I was desperately trying to find some kind of diagnosis, because this wasn't just chronic fatigue. There was preposterous weight gain. There was just horrific problems with bleed. But ultimately, I eventually got a diagnosis of premature ovarian insufficiency, which, for anyone who doesn't know, it's passed off as being early menopause or a menopause-like condition. My experience has been, it's not been like a menopause experience. It's been a very fluctuating hormonal experience. And I'm still not through the menopause part. I'm still technically in perimenopause. So I will have spent next year 25 years in perimenopause.
Okay. Oh, yes.
And it's grim. So the great thing about that was I realized that something is missing here in terms of how the medical model is looking at this condition that I'd finally got a diagnosis of, and how we deal in general with hormone conditions. And basically through my own research, and if I'm honest, a stroke of insight, there was a bit of a lightning bolt moment where I basically came up with the clinic model that is now at the core of our work, which we call the triangle of hormonal health. And it was just a way of explaining to women really how fundamentally important diet is, because one of the issues that we have is compliance, often with people. And I remember being in the mentality of, but I can have this treat. I've been really good all week. I can have this treat. And when I fundamentally understood how blood sugars work and their correlation with stress hormones, with the reproductive sex hormone, everything went off like light bulbs in my head. We realized, my business partner, Laura, and I started to put together some one-day CPD training courses for practitioners. We sent them off to our governing body to have them accredited as CPD, and they came back and said, no, you've actually invented a whole new branch of this modality. Go away and start a college. So we then jumped through the hoops to become an accredited college. Our modality at that time was an in-person training. It included bodywork. Kinesiology is a combination of nutrition and some bodywork. And we started teaching in February 2020 after years and years of creating textbooks. And then, of course, the world was hit by the pandemic and all of our hard work felt like it was going to go down the drain. But what we suddenly realized that became clear was the really phenomenal part of our work wasn't in the bodywork part of the modality. It was in the research that we'd done. And so we then were able to put the course without the bodywork, an actual course in itself, a functional wellness diploma for coaches. And then that's now been accredited all over the world.
I do have a lot of doctors and other practitioners who listen to my podcast. So this can be taken by anyone across the world, and they can use that as credit to a certification?
Yes, it is now fully accredited. So people with existing qualifications can do it as continuous professional development. Also, people who are coming into this, who are in a full career change, can start at the very beginning and then come out as qualified coaches with full certification.
You mentioned premature ovarian failure. I obviously know what that is, or insufficiency, I should say. But for my audience who are not medical and trying to learn from this podcast, can you talk about what that is and how it differs from perimenopause and menopause?
Yes. So it's still considered a fairly rare condition. About 17% of women will experience it. Some people develop it randomly, idiopathically, really randomly. Others will develop it because of surgery or medication, things like that. The ovaries stop doing the job that they're supposed to do, which of course happens as a natural process in menopause. The youngest person to ever be diagnosed in the UK was 14 years old. So it's not supposed to happen in these younger ages, and especially in this idiopathic way. And so no one has ever been able to medically tell me why it happened. I do see in my clients who have experienced it there, that obviously the medication and the surgical route, but when it has been idiopathic, there can be a period of high stress, a lot of trauma, some kind of surgery. There's something that actually just tips the body over and it just goes, the ovaries go, I can't do this anymore. And so, yes, it mimics menopause because the ovaries have stopped doing their job. The bit that people don't often understand, and I have met other women like me, I definitely had a history, but even before the birth trauma, of quite a lot of trauma. And what women often don't know is that we don't just make all of our hormones in our ovaries, we also make them in our adrenal glands. And in response to trauma, the body will choose the stress hormone cortisol over the making the reproductive sex hormones. And so when we've got someone with premature ovarian insufficiency, they're often, if they've got this history of trauma, not able to make even that small amount of hormone. And so this is where this fluctuating situation comes in, because they can be put on HRT, but the HRT 1 month is too high, then it's too low, and it can just be quite a lot to navigate. But the struggle for me has actually been really beneficial for my clients, because I have a lot about different HRTs and why they might not be working.
Isn't that uncanny how that happens? I've had not premature ovarian insufficiency, but as you were mentioning, perimenopause. And it took me a long time, even with me being a doctor, over the past 15 years. And I was even able to have a pregnancy through that. But there were issues related to the perimenopause that ultimately led to some issues and led to an emergency C-section. And I've had to really sit back and realize, okay, even though I wasn't menopausal, my hormones were just fluctuating rapidly. And what I should have been on is some progesterone during my pregnancy. And that's what led to placental abruption. And thankfully, everything worked out. But you don't even realize these are the things. And I didn't have that guidance either. So those are the reasons, my own experiences, plus what I've seen with my patients, plus my mom. And it's really led me to want to advocate for women as much as possible, because here in the States, I can reflect back to my years of medical school and residency. There was just a very small amount of information that was given. I actually remember, if your FSH is above 20, that means you're menopausal. No, not really. But that's literally what I remember being taught. So it was just very lack of information that was given. And then as the Women's Health Initiative came out, and it added even more chaos and confusion to the whole picture. So we both established why we do what we do. So when you began speaking openly about menopause and perimenopause, what was the reaction that you received from the women that you were speaking with and from the broader medical community?
You've actually summed it up beautifully. The thing that took me quite by surprise was that no one knew about menopause. So I didn't know. I knew what it was, but I didn't really understand it. When I first got given that diagnosis, I was just like, menopause. That's a terrible way to give a diagnosis anyway, but no, it's not. And also, I don't really know what menopause is and what does that actually mean. But the overarching realization that I had, the more that I went out and started doing, there's a lot of menopause cafes over in the UK. There's a lot of menopause groups. And I went and did a lot of talks at those groups. And just this realization that women they weren't given the information. I found out that we actually only started teaching about menopause in schools 3 years ago in the UK. Because all my peers kept saying, why don't we know this? And then just realizations we weren't all at school anything about menopause.
Yeah.
But then the bit that really surprised me with the medical community was that they too don't know about menopause. Even the doctors who are specialist trained for their GP practitioner surgery, for example, often don't know a lot of the stuff that we're talking about very regularly in the functional community. And I remember I'm a speaker on a national website, menopause.co.uk, and it was launched because of this lack of information. And what's so wonderful is the person who launched it, fabulous health advocate, he pulled all different groups of people and specialists. So there is the medical, there's the alternative view, so that women can find the pathway that feels right for them. That was really the motivation. But he launched it at a medical convention, and I was in the room, and there was 400 medical practitioners. And he said, how many of you went to medical school? And 400 hands went up. And he said, how many of you have trained in menopause? And 10 stayed up. And he went, that's why we need this website. So this was what really surprised me. And what was then really great about that as an opportunity was, if the women don't know, they can be taught. And if the doctors don't know, if the women know, then they can start self-advocating and they can start actually requesting the care that they want.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have turned into an advocate for my patients, and a lot of times I often help coach them on how to, let's say if they're seeing a specialist aside from me, how to approach them, how to talk with their breast specialist or their endocrinologist, or perhaps if they're getting surgery, what questions to ask and advocate for their own health. And I often find that these days there's more information that women have that's coming out on social media. And there, as we were talking earlier, more people who are coming out and talking about it and advocating for women. But I often find here in the States that women's patients still describe that they're not necessarily met halfway, that they're told that they're too young. Let's say they're 39, that they're too young for perimenopause and to wait until they're officially over and done with. How do you approach women in terms of the advice that you give them? You've often described functional wellness as a root cause approach. What does that look like in practice? Can you describe that for my audience?
Yeah. So when it comes to menopause specifically, I think there's the two ways to answer this. And the first way is for the woman who's having quite a textbook menopause, and that's in no way dismissing it. But if it's not really challenging, if you are responding to the symptoms are pretty textbook, there's nothing untoward happening other than those symptoms. And again, not dismissing them, because let's be honest, those symptoms in themselves are pretty grim. What's happening there is the natural fallout of hormones, and that can be navigated with the conventional HRT approaches. And actually some women who don't want that get on really well with those herbal approaches as well. However, I think that the functional wellness approach really comes into its own with women who are having a challenging menopause. So what I mean by that is someone who has gone to the doctor, and let's say for simplicity's sake, she is over 40. She's obviously perimenopausal, and they've put her on HRT, and the HRT doesn't work and she feels worse, or her anxiety's gone through the roof. So now she's being prescribed antidepressant and she's struggling and she's piling on weight and the anxiety, but not sleeping, but nothing seems to be working. I think that's where the functional approach really works, because what it looks like in practice is, my experience is that there are often what I call hormonal red flags that go all the way back, usually to puberty and even before. Irritable bowel syndrome, headaches and migraines, maybe some bad skin, heavy bleeds, painful bleeds, just stuff that we just pass off as this is all low level and fine. Actually, that's where we start to hone in, because the causes of those symptoms are often these underlying hormone issues that very commonly link back to the gut and to diet and things like food intolerances that can be completely overlooked. And my experience is that when you start looking at the health history of a woman who's going through a challenging menopause, it's just like they've had these sort of things bobbling around that get bigger and bigger. By the time that menopause comes and those hormones start dropping even further, everything is exposed and it can just feel like a mess. And my experience is that often when we start talking about, it just looks like this goes right back to when you were 15 and you experienced this and this. they're often so relieved because they felt all the while that something wasn't right, but it was just ignored. So that's what it looks like in practice, is really starting to hone in on not just the hormones, because obviously at menopause, the menopause to perimenopause transition, they're fluctuating and changing anyway, but what was going on before those hormones started to be a problem. So that's where we start to look at the gut.
So it's really sitting down with your client and getting a very in-depth history of what their symptoms, signs were like even when they were adolescents.
Yeah.
That's interesting because I read something recently where it was basically talking, and maybe it's in the same school of thought, where the article that I was reading was saying that the symptoms that you often can have post-pregnancy, postpartum, for example, if there's like a strong history of postpartum depression or anxiety, then those things can also manifest during perimenopause and menopause itself. So there's a similarity between what you're saying and what I read. But from what I understand, reading about you and learning about you, you focus on a 3 core pillar system. As you mentioned before, the adrenal glands, your blood sugar, and digestion. Can you tell us about why these are so important and foundational to women's hormone health?
I'll start with the adrenals and the stress piece, because I don't think that stress and women's hormones is talked about enough. And also what stress actually means. I don't even like the word stress because, again, we've normalized it. And I think there's such a glorification of I'm so stressed, I'm so busy. I always like to use this example of I had an Auntie Valda, and she died, gosh, must be about 15 years ago now. And she was in her late 70s then. She was a 1950s housewife. And the 1950s housewives had problems of their own. We know there was a lot of boredom, there was a lot of alcoholism and a lot of drug abuse. However, what they had was time. So she would get up in the morning and she'd make the breakfast for my uncle and my cousins. And then they would go up to school and work. And she would sit down with the radio on and have her breakfast. Then she would get up and she'd start doing some housework. And then at some point she'd sit down with a cup of tea and again, radio on or read a magazine. You find me a woman today who gets an opportunity to sit down with a cup of tea and listens to radio or flicks through a magazine. It just doesn't happen. And so what's happening is the stress of general day-to-day living is really affecting our hormone system. But that's just part of the picture, because then there's the other stressors that we can't control. There's pesticides, there's pollution, there's light toxicity, there's so much. There's the emotional work. There's such a long list. So I truly believe that there's an opportunity for a whole new wave of feminism to be had, where we're no longer habitually burning ourselves out, because we actually understand that women's bodies aren't designed to withstand prolonged periods of stress. That's the difference between our hormone structure, the male hormone structure. So that's why we need to focus on supporting women to stop glorifying stress, understanding how they can slowly start to chip away at reducing that stress and prioritizing their health. But then what we can do from a functional coaching perspective in terms of some genic support. But the blood sugars are so important as a piece of that picture.
Of course.
Because with the stress profile, the easiest way to get our hormonal axis to change is by changing what we eat and making sure that our blood sugars are balanced so that we don't end up with the insulin cortisol roller coaster. And also what people really overlook is food intolerances. So this is something I go on about a lot, because people could be talking about, I eat a keto diet or I eat high protein, low carb. I'm really careful with diet, but they don't realize that eating foods they're intolerant to. And as soon as we eat foods we're intolerant to, we do spike those stress hormones. So we focus as a foundational piece of work on diet, also because women in general for the last 50 years have fallen under the spell of diet culture, food fear. We've got food addiction. We've got so many sort of confusing languages and teachings around food, that actually bringing it back to some basics is really important. And then once we've got the food in place, that also is going to change that stress profile almost straight away. But we can start to choose what we eat in a way that balances our blood sugars, and we can start to change our stress. But we could do all of that really hard work. But if we have got an underlying unresolved gut dysbiosis or intestinal permeability, we aren't going to win against systemic inflammation. So we have to look at those areas as well. So that's why I call it foundational health, because there's no point trying to layer on the HRT and hope that's going to be the magic bullet that's going to resolve all your issues if those things aren't in place.
I'm not a functional medicine doctor, but even I know, right? If you're drinking too much alcohol and you're on HRT, I'm just using one example, then you're actually backtracking and it's not necessarily going to help you at all. Can you give us an example of a client that you helped with your method? Perhaps she was already on hormone replacement or not, so that we get to understand how your treatment helps patients.
Yeah, okay. I had a client actually who was early 50s and was really struggling with horrific migraines and exhaustion, but had really tipped into some kind of chronic fatigue. She was struggling with work, and she had a very incredibly high profile job, very high profile. And she had seen some of the UK's finest. We have a street in London called Harley Street. And that's where a lot of the private medical practitioners, it's renowned. This is where you go if you want the best medical practitioners. And she had gone through a variety of people, and so she was on HRT, and they had kept increasing her estrogen. But what no one had looked at was that, so we did Dutch testing. And for those who don't know, Dutch testing, it's the dried urine testing for comprehensive hormones. And it's different to serum blood testing, but it's looking at the metabolites of your hormones. So basically, what is your body doing with your hormones? So is it working with them effectively? But the bit that I love the most about the Dutch testing is women can often feel that they're estrogen dominant. There's a lot of talking about estrogen dominant. Your blood test can show that your estrogen's fine. What we can find out in a Dutch test is that I always say there's two types of estrogen in menopause, because you're not making so much of it yourself. There's the one that we're slapping on our skin, and then there's the one that your body isn't able to clear out. It's the recirculating estrogen. So your body's not detoxing it effectively. What we were able to see in the Dutch test was that she was not processing her estrogen effectively at all. And so this had been overlooked because the medical model you haven't got enough estrogen. We need to just keep giving you more. But as they kept giving her more and more, is recirculating and contributing to this horrific exhaustion, this what was looking like estrogen dominance. And so by knowing the right pathway to detox her, to support her liver, we were able to fundamentally get her detoxing that estrogen more effectively. Actually, the recommendation was then to actually maybe speak to her doctor. We can't advise on HRT, but actually the dose of estrogen that she was on was very high. We had a trend in the UK of very high estrogen dosing, and to actually maybe push back and ask for some more progesterone, because she was actually on a very low dose, get the balance, the ratio of those hormones better. We were effectively working with the detoxing, and we worked on diet and some food intolerances. And so that dramatically changed her life. The fatigue changed, the migraines changed. She was able to go back.
So the estrogen that she was not processing, it was leading to more fatigue. And what other symptoms did you mention?
Horrific migraines.
Migraines. Anything else that
weight gain.
More weight gain, yes. That is definitely
insomnia.
Yeah.
And insomnia.
Yeah, and insomnia as well. Yep. So we've been talking a lot about hormones in general and your methods, which obviously differs from the conventional approaches to menopause care. I often find when I talk about perimenopause, and today I had a patient who was 39, and I told her, you're not, and she's been having symptoms, fatigue, hot flashes, mood issues. It was the first time I met her, but I informed her that you're not too young to not be perimenopausal. In your experience with your clients as well as your own experiences, what are the most under-discussed symptoms, early symptoms that you can think of that women should be aware of, that we should pay more attention to?
I love that question. So from our perspective, we look at just coming back to that age piece, because I think that's really important. Statistically, when we look at a map of perimenopause, we have hormones are doing what they're supposed to do. And then at 36, we've got estrogen's tracking along. But at 36, that's when progesterone starts to, it literally looks like on a map, doesn't it? It looks like on a graph. It looks like it falls off the cliff.
Yeah.
That statistically starts at 36. So yes, medically, we don't say that someone's menopausal until way further down the line or perimenopausal, but this very early place of perimenopause can get totally overlooked. So the type of things that we see commonly are things like progesterone is our calming hormone. It's the hormone that calms us down, puts us into rest, digest. It's our anti-inflammatory hormone. And it's also a mood stabilizer. So when that starts to drop off even a little bit, we can be more snappy. We can be more irritated. We can actually become quite mindless. So one of the things I heard quite a lot when I was in one-to-one clinical practice was, I just keep finding I keep putting my keys in the fridge. Why am I putting my keys in the fridge? Or I forgot to pick my child up from school. I never forget to do those things. Very easy then to put that down to overwhelm. I'm overwhelmed. I'm just a bit tired. Less confidence. One of the things I heard regularly was, I struggle with driving all of a sudden out of the blue, or flying. I'm just really suddenly scared of flying. A bit of an increase in anxiety, a bit of weight instability, maybe not the big weight gain, but just a bit like, I'm just not fitting my jeans so easily. Or I'm just not sleeping as well. And these are the things that often don't lead someone to go to the doctor, but they stop feeling like themselves. And it can really have this knock-on effect with their confidence. And by the time they often do go to the doctor, that's when they're often being told, have some antidepressants.
Yeah.
I know in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the US, but whilst perimenopause is definitely acknowledged, our practitioners are treating from the end of the menopause transition. So all of this early perimenopause stuff is very much overlooked and often contentious as it sounds. I think women are often misprescribed medication when they're actually in early perimenopause.
Yes, I feel like I've been guilty of that myself, honestly, until I came to realize what was going on within my own self and my patients, where I realized, you know what? Not everyone needs to be on an SSRI. Like, let's look at the bigger picture here as to why this is happening at this stage of their life. And it's often very hard because a lot of my patients are working women who are mothers. They can be in the sandwich generation, so there's a lot on them. So it often takes many visits for us to really know each other before I can say, okay, I think there is an element of perimenopause, but I think we do need to also look at your personal and work stressors. So it becomes a whole picture that we need to really work on rather than just fixing the hormonal aspect. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. And in those early stages, I think it can be very easy to just want to reach for the low dose bioidentical hormones. And I'm so much more of a fan of, let's tighten up the diet. I get that you're overwhelmed. How do we make this more simple? What can you let go of if you've got to care for, like you say, the sandwich generation? Really, that kind of coaching. I'm such a fan of supporting the body to keep making the progesterone in the adrenals rather than taxing the body even further.
Yeah. And in that light, you've said that menopause isn't something to be fixed. And I agree with you. This is, for most women, as we mentioned, there are states where it doesn't happen, quote unquote, naturally, but it's not something to be fixed, but rather understood. And how does reframing menopause this way change the journey for your clients? How does that change for them?
Menopause doesn't have to be grim for everyone. It is for some. But even if you are sailing through menopause, it's still a rite of passage and it's supposed to be transformative. And there is something very powerful for women in losing their estrogen, because estrogen is our mothering hormone. It's what gives us tolerance. It's our caretaking hormone. And so as that starts to drop, my experience personally with my POI is that HRT, taking estrogen, can smooth over the experience of not having the hot flushes, not having the symptoms, but the underlying experience of no longer having my estrogen. I have lost my tolerance. I have lost my ability to caretake the way that I could. But there's so much power in that, because underneath that, even if you're on HRT, that transformation is still happening. And how that changes us is, if we lose tolerance, what we tend to lose tolerance for is things that don't serve us. There is some groundbreaking, it's tipping more into the emotional work around menopause, about how this transformation is carving us into the women that we want to be in our third age. That's what we tend to call it, this third age. And we can either be the little old women who sit there and go quietly, or we can carry on being these radical force majeures that so many of us are. And if we are able, if menopause is offering us an opportunity to look at what doesn't serve us, so actually drinking that much alcohol doesn't serve me, or this relationship doesn't serve me, or this job doesn't serve me, like, this isn't right. I remember being told that menopause shines a light on all the things that it's time to question. And it's your job to take a blowtorch to the things that you don't want anymore, because it's our opportunity to carve out this whole new life. So maybe it's this opportunity to listen this menopause to the lessons that it's trying to teach us. But maybe we can't party till dawn anymore and be really drunk and come in at 5 a.m. Maybe we need to go to bed at 10 o'clock after a nice cup of herbal tea and some soothing music. But instead of coming home when the sun's coming up, now we have the opportunity to wake up and be in the quiet and have this time for ourselves. And so maybe that doesn't sound so exciting, but it's just different.
Yeah.
And there is a grief potentially with what we have to let go of, but there is also some really great gifts. And I think that's where we can start to reframe and reclaim the opportunity that menopause gives us. And yes, it's really hard, the aging process. I still don't think we talk about it enough. The wrinkles, the losing bits in our body hurting, our hair graying, all the stuff that these days we can do something about, but there is still a grief associated with it. And I think that is a really important part of menopause, is grieving what we're losing, but then also this opportunity to claim the new.
Absolutely. I think what I tell myself, at least, is that you've earned the gray hairs and you've earned the wrinkles and maybe a few joints creaking and stiffness, but we've earned it. But I also think that, and maybe it correlates to the age and experience, but we also have a lot of experience and are wiser. And I think there's a lot of potential to really, at least, and I imagine that you and I are in the same generation, but for us to carve the way for women who are younger than us, so that they don't have to feel so confused about what's happening to their bodies when it comes to from going through puberty to pregnancy to perimenopause and menopause and beyond. That we can talk about this so that they can obviously learn from us, but they can continue teaching their kids as well, so that they don't feel confused, as our generation has been before, and definitely our moms. I look back and I don't think my mom necessarily knew what was going on with her body. And this is not a blame game, but I certainly did not receive much education from her. And even though I went to medical school, not enough there either. So it makes you wonder why. I wanted to go back, and you were mentioning kinesiology as central to your practice. Can you talk about what that is so my audience can learn about that? And how does this help your clients, the imbalances that standard lab tests might miss?
So kinesiology is a modality that originally came out of chiropractic. And so if you've been to a chiropractor or a physio and they're asking you to resist their pressure because they're checking how your muscles are responding and those kind of things. But the chiropractor who developed kinesiology discovered that there are 50 muscles that are actually connected via the nervous system to organs. So he theorized that when we're actually testing muscles, we're in a dialogue with organs. And for example, it can be really interesting when you start to understand a little bit about the muscles that are connected, because you can watch someone walking. I used to watch my clients walking in, and you could see if someone's not got glutes that are working, or a problem with their hips and their piriformis muscle. That's often a hormone problem. Or you can see that if people have got knee problems, the first question I would ask them is how their digestion, because it can be linked to the small intestine. And through the muscle testing, you can also test for supplementation. So the supplementation that the body is going to find beneficial when you find that there are these imbalances. So what tool does for us is it's really great at showing root causes, and it's really great at showing supplements particularly that are going to be really useful for that person. Because the problem with supplements is it can just be guesswork, educated guesswork, but guesswork nonetheless. And that is a minefield, and it's expensive. And the problem with supplementation is if we're taking loads of it, we can also be putting the body under metabolic stress. So it's finding a more bespoke solution. But what we now do in our online clinic, the way that kinesiology is called to what we do, is with kinesiology food intolerance testing, because I personally find it the most useful for people as a snapshot of the foods that they are intolerant to. So we are looking at it from that perspective. So for more bespoke supplement testing, and also for food intolerance testing, because you can really hone in on what someone's intolerant to. And it's different to a food intolerance test that someone sends off their blood, or an allergy test, because that's looking for a big response from the immune system. And we're looking at things that are often much more low level as an intolerance, as something that's just tipping the body into a bit of stress. We just don't want any cortisol response. A huge immune response, that's actually not that important information when we're looking at these foundations.
Okay, that's fascinating. Claire, I've learned so much from you, and I hope my audience is really listening carefully. If you were to talk to my audience right now, and most of my audience, I imagine, are women, if they could just take one step towards balance, what would you advise them?
More protein. Please eat more protein. For hormone balance, for healing that gut, for balancing those blood sugars. So the metrics that we work off of are, there's two ways of doing the math. There is, if you choose 1 gram of protein value in your food per pound of body weight. Personally, I prefer a more visual approach. And so the second way of working it out is, if you to put your weight into kilos, so let's say you were 60 kilos, you put a decimal point in front of the first number, so that would be 0.6, and that would translate to 600 grams in raw meat. And so it's a very high amount. It's a high number, and people are often surprised. When you start talking about some of the longevity medicine practitioners, they're talking about 1.6 grams of protein. So we're actually a bit of a halfway house, but it's quite an astonishing amount of food.
It is, yeah.
Please increase meat, fish, eggs. You can do tofu, but tofu can be tricky for hormone imbalances.
Right.
So we got to be talking about pure protein sources.
And we look to you as the guru for menopause care. Tell us about one ritual that you never skip yourself.
I move my body every single day. So I work out with weights and resistance for half an hour, but I do that 5 times a week. But I walk every single day for 45 minutes. One of the things I'm really passionate about advocating for women is, if their HRT isn't working, to keep pushing back and to educate themselves about the different types of HRT, particularly in the UK, because the current guidelines stipulate that women should be put on synthetics first, especially with the women who have challenging menopause, the synthetics aren't going to cut it. They need the
Yes.
body identical progesterone.
Yeah.
And so pushing back to get onto the body identical progesterones can often lead to quite heavy bleeding.
Right.
That often means it's not enough progesterone. So they need to really educate themselves to keep going back, to not be scared, to just everything that happens in their body, it's data, but to work with a coach who understands it if needs be. But yeah, to keep pushing back if they're not feeling great, there's something not right.
And Claire mentioned body identical. In the US, we call it bioidentical, which comes from plants. And I'm surprised to learn that because that's what if anything, the good thing about the WHI is that it taught us some of the bad things about the synthetic hormones. So those of us who are more inclined to use HRT, we're more leaning towards the bioidentical hormones.
Current regulations say that whilst the bioidentical, so in the UK we call them body identical because they've created the difference between compounded bioidenticals and the low dose bioidenticals being outside the framework of the regulations. So they've given them that name. They call what you would be calling the bioidenticals body identical. It's the same stuff.
Right.
That's the difference. But whilst the regulations, the NIC guidelines for practitioners state that whilst the body identicals have lower risk associated with them, practitioners should offer the synthetics first. And my suspicion is always because that comes down to money, because the NHS are giving it away essentially for very little money. It's problematic. When we've got a doctor who has done any kind of menopause training, they usually go straight in with the body identicals because they understand.
Claire, it's been an honor. And honestly, I'm so glad that you joined me today. If my audience wanted to find you, read your book, find your website, and find you on social media, where would they go?
They can go to all the social media platforms and you just look for my name, Claire Snowdon-Darling, and I am there. Claire Snowdon-Darling official on Instagram and Facebook, and Claire Snowdon-Darling on TikTok, or clairesnowdondarling.com. And then through any of those channels, you will find the college and you can find the clinic and you can find the book.
Fantastic. Thank you
so much. It's been wonderful.